whatever.
Yeah, yeah, whatever you have, bring what you
Okay.
have,
Yeah,
and I'll bring,
sure, sure.
because at this time it's all opinion. That's all we have.
Yeah,
But if
well,
it's right,
it's opinion, but you can be. My opinion is based on all the stuff that's out there. Like the Stirp team in 1978, which was the Shroud research project.
right,
And for a year and a half, they studied different ways of how to do tests on the Shroud, what tests that they could do. So it took them a long time, and it was the Savoy family who were the for five. It was in the possession of the Savoy family for 500 years, and they were the royal family of northern Italy, and they destroyed southern Italy, and they took the whole continent. But they're the ones who, in 1983, gifted the Shroud to the Holy See, which means the Pope, whoever is the
right.
reigning Pope. But before that, it belonged to the Savoy family. And it it has very interesting history. So the Stirp team for 5 days, 24 hours a day, had access to the Shroud, and they took all those tests. In fact, it was a VP analyzer that apparently they say it has something to do with trying to figure out how the density of the moon. But the VP analyzer, if you put a photograph through it, it comes up and certain things are higher and the wrong things are high and the wrong things are low, and it's kind of concave. But when they put the Shroud through, a picture of the Shroud through, it has 3D imagery encoded into it. And in fact, and that's what spurred the whole thing off. They said as the man who invented that said, that there was no image, nor natural or man-made. There's nothing on earth like this. No way, no how. He was a scientist. He was an atheist, and now he's a deacon in the Catholic Church. The Shroud changed his view because the image is impossible. In fact, they tested for all those things that you're actually discussing. People, they will say that myrrhs and oils were brought to the tomb, but in fact, the myrrhs and the oils, it was Passover. He had to be taken down. He
Right,
was dead already. That's why they had to break the legs of the other two.
right.
And so they
Because nobody is allowed on the cross after sunset on the Passover.
Right, so there was no time to even get the myrrhs and oils. They
Right,
tested the Shroud for myrrhs and oils, no myrrhs and oils.
right,
And they've found out recently what the only thing that could possibly have created that image. And it's not sweat, it's not oil, it's not vapors, it's not paint, it's not liquid. The body wasn't in there. They've determined
long
that
enough.
there's no way the body was not in there long enough to even rot, because vapors would see each fiber has 200 fibrils. Each thread is 200 fibrils, and each fibril, only 1/10 of the top of the fibril of one of the threads has the image. If you took your fingernail and you scraped it, it would be gone. So if it was vapor, if it was oil, if it was
It would go
sweat,
all the way through.
it would bend it. Yeah, it would go all the way through. So it isn't. It
Right,
isn't. It's some kind of a rapid aging that occurred so quickly. It didn't penetrate. It just quickly aged those top fibrils very fast. And they have pieces of shrouds. Usually the shrouds don't exist anymore because they decay with the body. And the
right,
pieces of the shrouds that they have where a body was in it, it looks all smooshed. There's no imprint on it. And the type of weave and the care it took to make the shroud and the type of weave can only be afforded by somebody who's very, very rich. But at the same time, in Europe, the fiber itself is actually cheap fiber, but back in Jerusalem it isn't. But they found this type of cloth in Egypt dating to the 1st century. So they've dated that particular cloth to the 1st century.
Well, the pharaohs and stuff were all wrapped. They're more or less their mummies.
Well, they were wrapped in strips, and in
Right,
Jewish custom, it's a shroud.
but
that's
that same high, more or less, say high class linen.
Yeah, but it's
what they
not in strips, but actually pieces of
strips.
linen, right?
Right.
And I'll tell you, maybe I should tell you at the end, the thing many years ago, when, you know, when you're a child, you're learning all about the shroud, you're kind of excited about it. And, you know, the carbon-14 said that it wasn't, but there's a reason for that's really been true.
I've never trusted carbon-14. That's been proven wrong many a times on many different things. So,
but people still, and well, of course, Wikipedia. Wikipedia, actually, the Ray Rogers, who was the physicist it was the head of the STURP team in 1978, atheist. And it was presented to him, a husband and wife, Sue Bedford and Joe Marino. And I believe the husband is a physicist. He's a scientist. She was a nurse. And she was looking at the shroud and on the computer, trying to figure it out. And she checked it out on infrared. And she saw that one corner that they took was glowing green. And so there was something different about that corner. Back in 1973, they put out the STURP team put out the guidelines how you scientifically should date this shroud. There should be 7 pieces taken from different parts of the shroud, so it's representative of the entire body of the shroud.
Right.
And they didn't do that. They just went in, cut one corner, and from that one corner, they cut 4 pieces. And then 3 pieces were sent to 3 labs. One was Oxford. It was funded by the British Museum. And there's a little snippet about that I found out recently.
I'm sure.
That whole test, the Freedom of Information Act, they've been trying since 1988 to try to get the information on how that test was done. And what they did was they pulled dates. They pulled the dates that they believed it was, because in the medieval times, it was a business to make relics. And so those are the dates that they were looking for. But after the 1988, after they did the test, $1 million from a very wealthy philanthropist that remains unnamed to this day. Maybe his initials are GS.
Maybe. You never know.
Oxford, $1 million. And $1 million in 1988 is a lot of money that they proved. And today, there's been other carbon dating tests done, non-invasive techniques done by light, and which actually dates the shroud to like 300 BC to 200 AD. So it falls right in the middle.
Right in that area where Christ would have been born and walked. And
Right,
but
exactly.
You see, one thing I always, over the years, like when I was doing the podcasting, what I used to tell people when they would bring up science, especially modern day, your 70s, 80s, and especially now, I says, look, if I told you that I believe the moon was made of cheese, and I'm going to give you $10 million to prove the moon is made of cheese, you're going to come back with definitive proof that the moon is made of cheese. because that's what science is today. They're whoever is paying the
Right.
scientist,
That's right.
they're saying this is what we want for a result. So in order for these people to stay in business and keep that money coming in, especially for universities, they want that funding to keep coming in. So they're going to give the people exactly what they ask for,
Right.
and so that's why when it comes into the 70s and the 80s with all the discrepancies and everything that is going on with the shroud, and well, yes and no, and well, look at this, well, look at that, the true science of it is like you were saying about the fiber. Okay, so let's go back all the way through 2000 years ago and look at all the fibers used up through all these periods, how they were made, what they were made of, how they were spun, how they were woven together, what looms were used. That will start giving you a timeline of when this was being put together and of that time period.
Yeah.
So now as far as the image, when Paul was Saul and he's on his way to Damascus, what happened to him? He was blinded by the light. I guess, I was blinded by the light. So that bright light, like an x-ray, if God were to take his son home, all flesh, where there's no flesh allowed in heaven, the flesh would have to be disposed of completely.
Or
Now, couldn't
transformed. It's
right,
transubstantiation.
exactly. Couldn't he? Could right? He could. Now, that bright of a light in an instantaneous transformation of taking his son's body home. Now, couldn't that have given that image onto that fiber?
That's that the what they believe, or what an Italian scientist, and I can give you the
Right.
name of
See,
him.
because I will
Uh,
let you know, I'm not Catholic. I never
yeah,
was.
it just
I've
the
been
shroud has
more
the
right,
shroud
more
is
Christian.
whether
Right.
it's an Italian or it doesn't matter. It's Jesus
Right.
Christ. Though,
Exactly.
so that's
Exactly.
the only thing that really matters. It has nothing to do. And, the Savoy family gave it to the Catholic Church because they're Catholic, right? So they gave
Well,
it to the
and
Pope.
plus if you take any of the artifacts from those times and everything else, remember the Knights Templar in the 12 and 1300s, the Knights Templar that were organized by the Temple of Solomon in cahoots with the Vatican, and they created this guardian of Jerusalem. That's what the Knights Templar were, and they protected all the artifacts they could find. So, who better to protect the shroud than the Catholic Church
Well, yeah,
at
the
that
Knights
time?
Templar were monks that
Right,
became warrior
right,
monks, and they were
right,
quite they were quite admired. They were great, courageous
right.
fighters in their
Oh,
time.
yes. Oh, yes, they were.
Uh, And in
And
fact, the Saracen knights and the Templars ended up admiring each other's courage. Uh,
right. And they had a lot of symbolism and a lot of see, it's something I didn't know that I just found out a couple years ago. I always knew what the Micmac Nation here in the Maritime Province. I'm in Maine. I'm in America, but
mhm.
Maine at one time, right after the Civil War, half of Maine was part of New Brunswick. It was turned over to Canada due to the trade treaties in the Civil War. So half of me, I'm half Micmac. So
I thought
that
you might be.
that
Yeah.
that nation all through Aroostook County, the whole northern part where I was born, everything it's all mixed. It's you're either Canadian or you're Indian. That's all there was up there. So I knew what our ceremonial flag was, and then I found out what the Knights Templar had for a ceremonial flag, and I was astounded. It's a white flag with a cross
Mhm.
on its side, and on the small part up here, where the more or less the top part of the cross T is, they have the moon and the sun. That was our ceremonial flag. Now, the Knights Templar was the sun up top and the moon on the bottom. So ours, it was just reversed. I said,
How
that,
interesting.
that's the same thing as ours.
That is
that's,
really
that's the
interesting.
same. It's the same thing. And I never knew. See, where I was getting this, I've been watching that, The Curse of Oak Island. I know it's a
Oh yeah, I
show.
watched all that. That's a
Right.
bunch of.
Right. There,
Oh my God.
it's become, but there is some good historical facts that do come from the show.
Oh yeah.
And so when I started looking into the ceremonial flags, it's like, wow. So does that mean that I'm not saying the treasure and the Ark of the Covenant and all that? No, that's not what I'm looking at. Did they come here?
Yeah,
Did
that's
the
right.
Knights
So
Templar
the question
escape?
is the Oak Island. Did they? That's true.
Did they
So,
escape to here? Because I know that,
oh yeah, because they were the King of France
right, and
was
plus,
was bankrupt, and he knew that
right,
they had a lot of money, and so he killed them, and they made up a bunch of stuff, and they
right.
worshipped a bearded man, head of a
Well,
bearded man,
the
which
Catholic Church was taking heat for their the Spanish Inquisition of you're going to be
Mhm.
Catholic or you're dead, and then they started blaming those barbaric acts on the Templar. So, oh, they're doing it. We didn't. They did. We didn't. They did.
Mhm.
And but we know that. I mean, look at today. Look at how our governments treat us today. It's like you either agree with us or you're the enemy. So I guess we're
Oh,
all
I
the enemy
know.
of we're all the enemy of the state.
So
So
let's what you were talking about. We were talking about going all the way back, and I thought that
right,
this
yeah.
was. Let me see. I'm going to try to kick this onto full screen. And this guy's Italian, which of course makes him superior. Yeah, I'm half Italian, so and but he studies ancient warfare and instruments of war, and
Mhm.
also ancient history. He's really good. He speaks many languages. So let me kick this on and listen to what he says about the history.
Savoy being the Italian royal family. The rule of the House of Savoy in Italy ended in 1946 after World War II, but it's in 1983 that they will gift the Shroud to the Holy See. As an interesting fun fact, some of the members of the Savoy family over the years actually got into the habit of cutting little snippets from the Shroud and giving them as royal gifts. Could you believe that? Well, before coming to Italy, the Shroud was in France. It was the property of Margaret de Chamy, who in 1453 sold it to the Savoy family in exchange for not one, but 2 castles. As a little side note, the Catholic Church was particularly happy about that, and they excommunicated her. Before that, the Shroud has a certifiable history that goes all the way back to 1349, which is when it appeared or surfaced in Lille, France, being the personal property of the French nobleman Geoffrey de Charny or Geoffrey de Charny, no idea. Did the family ever tell us how they got the Shroud? No, they only said that it was freely given. Then what about before that? Well, if the Shroud is a medieval forgery, then it would be made in the 14th century, as the carbon dating seems to suggest. Therefore, that would be the end of it. But there are a lot of mentions that predate that specific date that have to do with the Shroud that are absolutely fascinating. Now, is it the same Shroud? We don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But I think they're very interesting. So let's check them out. Historical records do mention a shroud that really looks exactly like this one in 1204 in Constantinople. We'll discuss how it got there in a minute, but there is in fact a gap of 150 years between this mention in Constantinople and Lille, France, which are called the missing years, where no one knows where the shroud went. But there is a possible indication or a suggestion or a hint that could answer that question, and it has to do with the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade was endorsed by the Catholic Church, where it was mostly perpetrated by the French, and the Venetians, the latter providing most of the transportation and logistics. The original intent of the Fourth Crusade, if we are to believe the accounts, was to secure certain routes to the Holy Land. But things didn't go that way. In fact, one of the things that happened that created a lot of controversy was the siege of Constantinople. Constantinople was an incredibly rich and successful city, and the French and the Venetians decided to do a little detour and go siege it. Now, this was a big deal because at the time Constantinople was Christian, and Crusaders were specifically forbidden to siege a Christian city, but they didn't care. Period records tell us that after months of siege, the troops stormed into the city and they started looting. And when I say looting, I don't mean just private property or royal property. I'm talking about they started looting churches too. Good Christians, these Crusaders. Really. I'm impressed. But medieval archives tell us a difference between how the French looted and how the Venetians looted. The Venetians mostly stole gold and silver. The French instead were more interested in holy relics. Now check this out. There is a report written by Robert de Clare, who was a French knight who participated in the Fourth Crusade and was at the siege of Constantinople. He said that in Constantinople there was a cloth that was raised up every Friday on a church in the city of Constantinople to represent Jesus' resurrection. He talked about this as a holy relic, and he also says that no one, neither Greek nor French, ever knew what happened to the cloth. What does it mean that the cloth was raised, and was this cloth in fact the Holy Shroud? If you remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that some of the folding lines on the linen seem to suggest that the linen was folded over a wooden batten of some sort or a block, and that I was going to tell you something about an hypothesis on what this would be. Well, this is the hypothesis. The idea is that a device was created in Constantinople to not only store the cloth inside this box, but also make it go up and raised vertically. A sort of very ceremonial and ingenious way to kind of represent Jesus' resurrection. This would make sense in Constantinople because Orthodox tended to be very ceremonial like that. A replica of a device like that was in fact recreated in our day and age, and it works. So is this device mentioned by this specific French knight the same that left the marks on the shroud that we have? And if that is the case, then would that indicate that the shroud is the same and was indeed in Constantinople during the siege in the early 13th century? If the answer is yes, then that would explain how, from these crusades, the cloth went from Constantinople all the way to France. This isn't full-on evidence, we can't prove it, but it's interesting, and there is more. For the shroud to be real, its history had to have begun in Jerusalem. If you're a Christian, that would mean that after Jesus' resurrection, he would have left the linen cloth in his tomb, and then he would have left. If you're not a Christian, then after Jesus' death, his body would have been removed, leaving the linen in the tomb. Okay, so what now? Let's have a look at what we know of the world at the time. In the 1st century AD, Rome was of course the most important city in the empire. The second one would have been Alexandria of Egypt, but the third largest and more important city within the Roman Empire would have been Antioch. Antioch was annexed by the Roman Republic in 64 BC and was made the capital of the Roman province of Syria. Before that, it was the center of the Seleucid Empire. It would have been a city of magnificent temples, theaters, baths, and aqueducts. The city of Antioch also has some important connections within the history of Christianity, in the sense that it was one of the most important communities of Christians lived in Antioch, and it's probably where the term Christian was coined. Now, when it comes to the history of the Shroud, what we're trying to build here is a connection between the city of Jerusalem and the city of Antioch. In 70 AD, we have the sack of Jerusalem, a decisive event in the First Jewish-Roman War, during which a Roman legion led by future Emperor Titus besieged Jerusalem. That was mostly because at this time, Jerusalem had become the center of Jewish rebel resistance in the Roman province of Judea. So what happened to the original linen used to wrap Jesus' body at this time? An answer might come from what is called the Sermon of Athanasius. Let's check it out. Athanasius tells us that early Christians fled the city of Jerusalem before the attack actually began and went to Antioch. This was written years after the fact, so we can't really consider it period evidence, but there is a mention that is interesting because Athanasius tells us that the people that fled took with them the very important and sacred icon of Christ. Now, we don't know what this icon was, but it is possible that it was the original linen, particularly if it already had the image within, something that we can't really prove, but it's interesting. So if this connection were to be true, the original cloth would have moved from Jerusalem to Antioch. In 540, however, Antioch is sieged and destroyed by the Persians. Now, at this time, within the city of Antioch, there was a patriarch by the name of Euphrates, and he tells us that he struck a deal with the Persians, telling them, you can have everything, but don't destroy the main church. And the Persians agree. Keep in mind that everything else, the rest of the city, was leveled to the ground. This is when Euphrates leaves the city and moves to the province of Cilicia. 14 years after this event, in 554, an image of Christ impressed on linen appears in the city of Camulliana, which is in Cilicia. The Patriarch of Antioch was definitely one of the most prominent and important members of Christianity. So it's not impossible to think that he would have brought, or would have even had, and then brought the icon, the original linen, to Camulliana. And then 14 years afterwards, we see an image appear with that description. This is the first time that the idea of an image of Christ impressed on linen is mentioned historically. In 554, another image, so a different linen, with the image of Christ impressed, appears in the city of Edessa. After having taken Antioch, the Persians will also try to siege and take Edessa, but they will fail. And it's interesting that the historical record tells us that the people of Edessa believed that it was the sacred icon, the image of Christ, that had protected the city. The situation becomes even more intriguing with the following two dates, 574 and 943. These are the dates when the Byzantine Empire seized both images. First, the image of Camulliana, and then the image of Edessa. Both now belong to the Byzantine Empire, and they are brought to Constantinople. Was one of these two the shroud we are looking at and examining today? It's possible. And if that were the case, it would create a historical link of events that would lead from Jerusalem all the way to Constantinople. And remember that from the previous section in history, we learned that a sacred, very important icon was taken by the French in Constantinople during the siege, during the Fourth Crusade. The elites of Constantinople even writing a letter of complaint to the Pope, where they specifically mentioned the French even took the most holy image of Christ. So what I'm trying to say here, I'm not trying to absolutely defend the image of the current shroud, but I'm trying to say that there is a logical, possible line of events that lead from Jerusalem all the way to Lille, France. Now, some people say that this is definitive evidence that the carbon dating is wrong. I disagree with that. It is not definitive evidence, but it is interesting because it also helps us understand that there is a possibility that the shroud we have today is the same as either the image of Camulliana or the image of Edessa. However, I also believe it's critical to be intellectually honest and underline and say that forgeries, particularly in the medieval period, but also throughout the classical period, were in fact made. Many times, a relic of that stature would have a massive geopolitical power behind it. So there is absolutely motive to create a false like that. Radiocarbon dating is essentially a method designed to measure the residual amount of the radioactive carbon isotope C14 found in a tested sample. The fuss about the carbon dating results is the fact that they point, when it comes to the origins of the current shroud that we have, between a date between 1260 and 1390. But there is some controversy and a very heated debate on the validity and correctness of these test results, with people trying to absolutely push the shroud as being true, completely refuting the results, and people who instead consider these results to be the last nail in the coffin, which unmasks the shroud as a fraud. I would like to propose a more balanced approach to this. The most logical question that we would have to propose right now is the following. How accurate is carbon dating? Of course, considering how deep and complicated carbon dating is as a topic, and considering how long this video is already, I probably can't fit everything into this section. I'll have to make a dedicated video. But for now, I'd like to leave you with two facts. Number one, carbon dating is a useful tool, it's a scientific tool, and it's usually pretty reliable. But it's not infallible. So it shouldn't be considered as a definitive, absolute proof, but it should instead be corroborated by archaeological, literary, and other forms of evidence, and possibly done on different sections of the one object that has been examined. Two, we also need to look at how a certain carbon dating analysis was carried out. Who performed the test? The radiocarbon dating of 1988 on the shroud was done under the project management of the British Museum. The three laboratories that were involved were the laboratory of Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona. They measured the relative amount of C14 on the shroud, and there is no reason to doubt their professionality in making such measurements. How was the test performed? The original plan was for the scientists to use 7 different samples from all over the shroud. What actually happened is that they only used one sample, a little snippet that was taken from the bottom right corner of the shroud as you look at it from the front. Could the whole shroud, maybe just the snippet they have taken, have been compromised? Well, that is what the proponent of the idea of the carbon dating being wrong are trying to push. So let's see where they're coming from. If the carbon dating is indeed wrong, then it would have to be in error by a large factor. So what would be the possible reasons to explain such a largely mistaken result? Well, whenever we work with carbon dating, we have to keep in mind that the validity of the dating is based on the following assumptions. The sample or samples tested are representative of the whole. Some people say that the corner might have been the area of a medieval repair. Second, the possibility of carbon contamination. For the tests to be correct, no contamination has had to have affected the C14 content of the sample area except for the natural radioactive decay of C14. And as explained, in order to give accurate aging data, the carbon debris must not have had significant contamination. Reweave hypothesis. This hypothesis wants to suggest that the corner of the shroud that they used for carbon dating was used for repairing the shroud. However, the experts involved in the 2002 Shroud Conservation Project examined the sample area and reported that they could not identify any evidence of reweaving. The next idea was...
And I'm stopping it there because I have evidence that that is not true. The Ray Rogers, who's the head of the Shroud projects, he is the one when he thought it was preposterous that Sue Bedford and Joe Marino were saying that there was a reweaving technique done to the corner of the shroud, in the corner that fluoresced green. And what she did was she didn't say anything. She went to 2 textile experts and asked, what does this corner look like to you? And both of them said a French reweaving technique. And the likelihood is that's the corner that's constantly held at when they hold it up. Or it could be some of the pieces that they snipped off. But what they did was in the Middle Ages, they took the old fabric and the cotton, and they can dye cotton. They can't dye linen. That's why they used cotton, and they reweaved it. And there was found matter dye on that specific corner. Now, Ray Rogers thought it was preposterous that these 2 people were making this, because he was an atheist and a scientist, and he was just sick of hearing all these different ideas, people coming up with all different reasons why the carbon dating was wrong. And he goes, I can prove that in 5 minutes. He had a reserve sample of the corner that was taken, and he looked under a microscope, and he said, my God, they're right. It was rewoven. And it was in his peer-reviewed paper. His paper was peer-reviewed in 2005. He wrote the paper in 2002. Peer-reviewed means other scientists reviewed this and agreed that it's true. It's his paper that discredited, and his findings that discredited the carbon dating technique. Now, Metatron here is referring to, because I'm going through the whole web finding all this stuff, he's referring to a Wikipedia article. And this is not true. I can't find anywhere in 2002 anybody disputing the fact that there was even Richard Dawkins presented with this. And he's a big fat atheist. He said, if they did the carbon test wrong, it should be redone. Then you have to throw it out. Even he said you have to throw it out. Now, Metatron presents very good points. There's a lot of good stuff in his presentation, but it always comes down to, it's like, it's right there on the web. You can go to shroud.com You can, I can find it. You know, I can find the PDF. Let's see if I even have the PDF open. Probably have it linked here. The PDF of his report. Article rating. Maybe it's at the top here.
Don't mind my puppy dog is wondering what's going on.
I got a doggy too.
So she decided to jump on my lap and say, what's going on here? But no, you see that makes sense. I mean, you take something that even when you come into the 12 to 1300s, so you're talking a shroud that's 12, 1300 years old. Damage that it's acquired and people trying to fix it. And so, of course, when you have people that want to discredit not just the shroud, but they want to discredit Christianity, they want to discredit the Catholic Church or any form of religion, of course, they're going to go to an area that's been rewoven. So you know that that's newer than the original, and they're going to circumvent the truth and the true way of doing things. I mean, that's the modern day way of today when it comes to any of this stuff.
I'm trying to I was very good at laying all this stuff down here, and to really get a good what he says, that Tron says in the
hypothesis being that living microbes such as bacteria or fungus would have contaminated the shroud, leaving a sort of bioplastic coating on the fibers, which would... As you can see, there are four matched repetitions of L-shaped holes on the shroud. These are burning holes, but they predate the 1530 fire. The four matched sets of holes show a progressive level of damage. Forensically, this seems to suggest that when the shroud was burnt, it was folded in four. The most accredited hypothesis for this sort of burning damage is that the cloth was burnt accidentally with hot incense during an ecclesiastical rite. A 1516 painting shows the holes, which is why I say that they definitely happened before the big fire in 1532. And that is because the shroud here doesn't have the side marks that will be a result of such fire. Worth of note that the L-shaped holes are present in Hungarian frame manuscript dating 1192, and the art itself probably dates back to 1160 or 1170. Also note the zigzag lines on the actual weave, which represent specifically the herringbone pattern.
See, I'm trying to find the picture. Oh, do you know what? I realize that even though we're not talking, if I don't mute the mic, there's a double. It can create
There's an echo.
An echo.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's
right.
why I have my headset on, because if I were to set this up like I was doing my podcast, every time you talked, my big microphone over here, okay, would be picking it up.
Oh, I forgot all about that. So I can imagine that the people who were here have already left because of the echo is really irritating. So, you know what I'm thinking? I think we should probably just end the stream. I can't believe. So if we do this again, it's 10:10 now. If we do this again, remind me to cut the mic when I play a video. It's just otherwise it's I'm sure that's the reason why everybody left, because it's really annoying. Yeah, so oh Jim, I feel terrible, everybody left. And that's the reason why it dawned on me. That's the reason why.
Oh
So
yeah, we can
we
set
can
this
set
up
something. Yeah,
again.
we can set this up again, and we'll be a little more organized
R- Right.
about it.
And
It's a stupid little thing, but I forget. It's as if I've never live streamed before. I forget these stupid little things that you have to. There's just like little things that make it better, and just nixing out our mics. And there's 2 microphones, which means that's a double echo.
right.
So that's
See,
real.
that's why I wear the headset, because the way the headset works is I turn off the microphones to the camera. But then with this here, they work in tandem together so that the microphone does not pick up anything except for my voice.
Right.
Or if the dog comes up and starts whining and saying, "Let me
Right.
on your lap," in the middle, in front of the camera. And
Oh
but
my
no, but
gosh.
that's very interesting what this guy was, what he was saying, especially about the carbon dating. There's many, in many different aspects, not just with the shroud, but throughout every different little thing of throughout history, they use the carbon 14 dating, but